The presenter for this evening is Dr. Brent Hughes. He is an associate professor in the Department of Biology at Sonoma State University. Research in his lab, the Coastal Ecological and Conservation Lab, seeks to determine the process that affect the stability of coastal ecosystems. His research centers around coastal habitats, seagrass, salt marsh, and kelp, aka foundation species, which provide very valuable ecosystem services, yet are threatened by human activities. Currently, his research focuses on four themes. One, the consequences of predator recovery on the functioning and stability of ecosystems. The relative influence of climate drivers and anthropogenic threats of coastal ecosystems. The role of foundation species in structural nearshore diversity and functioning, in turn, that drives maintaining foundation species stability. And finally, informing management and restoration on the process that drive ecosystems resilience. Thank you for coming out tonight, and I present to you Dr. Brent Hughes.
Hey, thank you, Gregory, and thank you all of you out there listening, and thank you to the Sonoma Land Trust for inviting me for this talk this evening. I'm very honored to be here. And what you're looking at, just to kind of follow along what Gregory was mentioning with the land acknowledgement. I echo those sentiments. And what you're seeing here is what we call a rediscovered food web. Most of you probably are not familiar with this food web, given the context of sea otters and what we know about sea otters. We're starting to, through their recovery, starting to learn what these animals probably used to be like hundreds to thousands of years ago, when all we had around here were indigenous tribes who were probably very, very familiar with this very food web. So we're going to revisit this food web and explore it a little bit more as we go through this talk. The story for today starts in this somewhat relatively small estuary. It's relatively small compared to San Francisco Bay, called Elkhorn Slough. Now, Elkhorn Slough, as you can see on the map, it's that star in California. It's right in the heart of the Monterey Bay. And I would just like you all to kind of look at this landscape. I mean, we're going to take just maybe 5 seconds, 10 seconds, and reflect on the landscape that you see here. And so let's just do that now. Okay, so what you see in this picture is a landscape with lots of different functions going on. You're looking down the main channel of the Elkhorn Slough estuary, facing due west. So right at the outer edge of that estuary is the Monterey Bay Submarine Canyon, which is as deep as the Grand Canyon. But within the watershed, immediately to the land edges of the estuary, to the right or to the what would be our north, there's a lot of marshland, and then upper woodlands that are dominated by oaks, some native grasses, also some non-native grasses. And to the left or to the south, you have a lot more human infrastructure. You have a lot of agriculture. As you can see to the left, that's actually a little bit of agriculture mixed with a dairy farm. And then in the very background, you can see the power plant at Moss Landing that is surrounded by a fishing village. And so it's a major fishing port for Monterey. So there's, in this one little framework here, there's a lot of things going on. In the water, you can see in the darkened kind of areas that look like shadows, those are seagrass beds. And this is where my career really started out. I started out as a graduate student at Moss Landing Marine Labs, which is just to the southwest of the power plant there. And I was a grad student there. I did my master's, and that was my first introduction into this estuary Elkhorn Slough. I wasn't really doing any research in Elkhorn Slough, but I was helping out friends, and we would teach classes and do things in Elkhorn Slough. So I was starting to become familiar with Elkhorn Slough, and a lot has changed since that first time I've stepped into Elkhorn Slough, which is about 2002. Um, and so fast forward from 2002 to really the start of me doing a PhD that was focused on estuarine ecology. My studies for my PhD were primarily focused in this one estuary, Elkhorn Slough. I'm a plant biologist or a marine botanist. That is my background. So all of my interests really are based on algae and kelp and salt marshes and seagrasses and these really important kind of foundations of an ecosystem. Now, Elkhorn Slough is unique in some ways. It's got a lot of the same features that you might see in a typical Central or Northern California estuary, where it has salt marshes, it has seagrass beds, but it also has some problems. And one of them is nutrient enrichment. It sits at the foot of the Salinas Valley, which is one of the most productive agricultural areas that we have in California. And those the crops that they grow there, they're quite, they're expensive crops. They're like Brussels sprouts and strawberries and artichokes. And the common practice is to put a lot of fertilizer onto those farms. Those fertilizers end up getting into the watershed and into the streams and the creeks and eventually make their way down to the Elkhorn Slough. And it results in about a dump truck of fertilizer every single day gets into this small estuary. And, the estuary, that main channel is about 10 kilometers. And so about, a dump truck of fertilizer every day has resulted in some of the highest nutrient concentrations reported on the entire planet for a coastal ecosystem. And then what happens in Elkhorn Slough because of that are these massive algal blooms, primarily in the form of macroalgae. And, and especially this one genus of algae called ulva. You can see that's me in my youth, my younger days, holding what I'd like to claim is one of the biggest pieces of ulva ever discovered, which may or may not be true, but at the time it was very big. And so they grow these unusually big, large mats of algae, macroalgae that can smother beaches. As you see on the left, it can smother seagrasses. It can smother, just basically float in the water and just smother the water column and cause all sorts of issues such as, especially hypoxia, which is the drawdown of oxygen, which is just really bad for fish. But around this same time that I was starting my PhD in 2008, 2009, I was really interested in Elkhorn Slough, and I got really interested in the seagrasses at Elkhorn Slough, primarily because of this one paper that was published by a bunch of really famous seagrass biologists in the journal Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and was looking at seagrasses globally as best as they could at that period. You can see where they included the globe, which was really just North America, Europe, and Australia. And anyways, so they put together all the existing data that they could find, and they found, oh my gosh, seagrasses are not only declining, but they're declining at an accelerating rate globally. And when I started looking at the seagrasses in Elkhorn Slough, all predictions would predict that there shouldn't be seagrass there, given the nutrient loads that occur in the estuary, and also the macroalgal blooms that just the algae that forms in the estuary because of all the nutrients. But my first kind of observations of the seagrass when I first really started studying it was, and especially comparing it to seagrasses in San Francisco Bay or Tomales Bay, they just looked a lot healthier. They were bigger, they were greener, they weren't covered in algae or epiphytes, and they were also expanding. And so this grass, the seagrass, which we call Zostra, that's the genus, um, it's kind of like a mini kelp forest. It does all these really important things. We don't really see it that much, us humans, because it's usually in murky waters where we avoid. So luckily there's people like me who love swimming in this stuff. And so, but what that was our big observation is like, wow, this grass should not even be here. In fact, it was almost extinct in the early 80s in Elkhorn Slough. And so it just kind of led me to explore this further. Why is this grass healthy? Why is it expanding? And so I started doing experiments just with the primary seagrass zostra, which you can see in these buckets. And then I, would run experiments where I was covering, where I was putting this green algae, the ulva or sea lettuce, into buckets. And so I was just doing experiments in buckets, which is very typical for us marine ecologists to do. And I planted seagrass, and I planted seagrass with the algae. And and so, my experiment, once I started it, wasn't running very well. And it's primarily because not only was I getting this green algae, right? That was the whole point, was to look at how these two species interact. But what I ended up getting, because I was putting a bunch of nutrients in the water as well in these buckets, were these big blooms of this other type of algae that we call diatoms, that can basically cover and smother the seagrass, just like the green macroalgae can. This is just filamentous or hair-like algae, and it can completely cover the grass. And when it covers the grass, essentially it shades it and kills it. I didn't necessarily want this in my experiment. It just kind of happened. It was one of these kind of experimental, what we call an experimental artifact. And so I tried various techniques to get rid of it. And so here's what my experiment looked like at UC Santa Cruz's Long Marine Lab. Just a bunch of buckets with seagrass and algae. And so I put shades over it, just shade cloth that you would get at like a an outdoor store for your landscaping store, same stuff. And I was still having this problem with these diatoms growing on the grass. So I, looked at possible solutions, which included like some chemicals that I didn't want to use that kill diatoms. And I found this paper that was published in 1993 by a woman named Susan Williams, who ended up being one of my primary mentors, and not only for PhD and my postdoc, but really for life. But in this paper, she described for the first time how important invertebrate grazers or invertebrate herbivores can be for seagrasses, especially Zostra, our local native seagrass. And these herbivores are primarily these two species. One is this big fat thing right here. That's called Philoplesia taylori. That's the species name. We call it Taylor's sea hare. It's a sea hare, it's a sea slug, whatever you want to call it. And in between these two sea hares is this isopod called Idotea. And so what Susan found was that these animals are super cool because they will eat the algae that grows on the seagrass, but they won't eat the seagrass itself. They're kind of like little lawnmowers. And so I was like, wow, finally, I think I've seen these things in Elkhorn Slough. And so I put these things in the bucket, and they like lick the bucket clean. Here's one of them in our bucket, and you can see all the grass is totally green and free of algae. And so what ended up happening was kind of like an aha moment. What I noticed was that when we compare these sea slugs to sea slugs like in San Francisco Bay and Tomales Bay, they're just a lot bigger and they're way more abundant. And same goes for those isopods. And so, this was neat. I ended up exploring like, well, why is the seagrass expanding? And, looking for all these, big reasons like storms and changes in oceanographic conditions and just anything you could possibly think of, management that occurred in the estuary. And nothing seemed to work. Nothing was explaining the expansion of seagrass, until one day I received a very, very unique data set that came from a volunteer who I was working with, who's been kind of a partner in all this research. His name's Ron Eby, and he was good friends with this tour operator named Jan Gideon, Captain Jan Gideon. And Jan Gideon was operating a tour boat, basically a pontoon boat out of Elkhorn Slough, and taking tours of tourists up and down the estuary a couple times a day for about 15 years. And he would have these tourists do something cool that every time they saw a sea otter, he said just click, 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 click. And so what they were doing was essentially counting all the sea otters in the main channel of Elkhorn Slough. And then he did that for 15 years and kept a record of all this data. And then so one day, Ron gave me this data set. He said, "Well, why are you?" We were kind of like giggling, like, "Oh, maybe sea otters will fit with seagrass." And when we put the time series of sea otters overlaid with seagrass, they kind of fit together like a glove. And that became an aha moment. And after that, we explored this hypothesis that maybe sea otters could be the reason why we are seeing healthy seagrass. So we ran experiments in both the laboratory at like in buckets where we kind of recreated scenarios with and without sea otters. And in Elkhorn Slough, like most estuaries where you find sea otters, the big link is not like it is in the kelp forest where sea otters eat urchins. Here it's they're eating crab. And so that is what we kind of hypothesized was the big linkage. And after, doing these experiments, both in the lab and in the field where we were caging out sea otters and part of the seagrass, so doing a predator removal exclusion experiment, and then observing long-term data and looking at that from a correlational perspective, because we have this great data sets of both the sea otters and seagrass in the estuary. Um, and then, finally, we're comparing Elkhorn Slough with other estuaries that currently don't have sea otters, like Tomales Bay. And we're seeing every kind of way we looked at it all pointed to the sea otter. And the result was really the sea otters were the big driver of the resilience of seagrass in the estuary. And we ended up publishing this paper in PNAS Proceedings of National Academy of Sciences about 10 years ago. And now it's in textbooks as this kind of textbook, what we call a trophic cascade. And this is where top predators have these kind of disproportionate effects on the ecosystem. And you can see this is the diagram from this marine biology textbook, um, showing where the situation where it's like if you have no sea otters, then that kind of releases these crab, and these crab are cancer crab. They're kind of similar to Dungeness crab. They can get quite big, and they can be important predators when there's not things like sea otters around. And so those crabs will eat those grazers, those sea slugs, and those isopods, which leads to very unhealthy seagrass that's just loaded with epiphytes and, in fact, dying back. When the sea otters were added in, they essentially removed the crab so they were not even really functionally present. They were still there, right? They're a lot smaller and way less abundant. And so that's just created a situation where these grazers could thrive and really do their thing and keep that seagrass clean. So I won't go into all the specifics of this. You have the links to the papers. PBS, we worked with PBS on a documentary, a short documentary. If you're all interested, here's the link. And you can just Google in sea hares scour seagrass by the seashore. It's a 5-minute video, and it's cool because it really highlights these sea hares, which are kind of, the sea otters get a lot of credit for this trophic cascade and the health of seagrass, but these are the true champions, or these little sea hares. So yeah, and what we ended up finding is we ended up doing restoration. So we ended up planting seagrass in areas where sea otters had been expanding to, but there currently wasn't seagrass. And then we planted in areas that had seagrass and sea otters, and we did all these tests, and what we found was that, wow, seagrass restoration was very, very successful when you had sea otters around. And now the seagrass in Elkhorn Slough has reached almost historical levels. So, which historical meaning back to the 1930s before we humans started doing all these modifications to the estuary. All right, I'm just going to pause, get a quick drink of water, and I'm sure you could use a pause too. So this has us wondering, it's like Elkhorn Slough. Here's one example of a sea otter potentially coming back to a system, um, and really changing it in for the better. We ended up, and colleagues have ended up doing studies now with looking at sea otters and seagrass from here to Alaska, and we're seeing a lot of these positive effects no matter where they're at. And so it's kind of one of those cases like we weren't really looking at it until we were looking at it, and now we look everywhere and we see these sea otters using these estuaries. And so we're starting to wonder, like, well, are these, sea otters ghosts of estuaries past? And there's a lot of evidence that suggests just that. One, the Native American midden record, especially around places like Emeryville, um, Drake's Estero up here in Point Reyes, Elkhorn Slough, these middens, which are just basically burial or trash grounds that have a lot of bones and shells. What we find in these middens are throughout almost the entire stratigraphy are sea otter bones. And so we know because of that that the Native Americans were in these big estuaries like San Francisco Bay were probably interacting with sea otters in the estuary. And then if you fast forward to when the sea otters were really being hunted to extinction, those hunters took meticulous records of pelts. Um, and there was descriptions of sea otters in San Francisco Bay, and I'm going to paraphrase one of them from one of the hunters, and goes something like the water was appeared to be covered in black sheets due to the great quantity of sea otters that were in, and I believe they called it the Santa Clara estuary, which was the San Francisco Bay, the South San Francisco Bay. There's estimates that the San Francisco Bay historically probably had around 10,000 sea otters. The entire state of California currently has about 3,000. So there's a good chance that sea otters might be good for estuaries, but estuaries might also be good for sea otters. Okay, so to kind of retract things, and I've kind of ignored the kelp forest, but in the kelp forest, this is kind of where we kind of modern day ecology and science first, we're studying sea otters because that's where they were when they were hunted to extinction. They were limited to the outer coast of most areas, including Alaska, down here in California. And so we know that sea otters, they can eat urchins and thereby kind of can protect kelp forests. So they're kind of like these heroes of the kelp forest. And now that we're finding that they're kind of the heroes of the seagrass. But what's been really fascinating as we've been studying these animals is they're starting to use not just seagrass as kind of like this unique, weird habitat, but now we've been finding that they use salt marshes, which has never been seen before. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about that. But what it kind of scales up to when we go beyond just thinking about sea otters is that we're seeing a lot of consumers, these big animals, big consumers, predators are because we are now in this kind of more state of conservation as a society. We're starting in protection is starting to happen. We're starting to see animals use areas that we previously didn't think they could use, such as this is a harp seal in on a North Carolina beach. North Carolina is considered subtropical. Harp seals are considered more Arctic animals, and so they're kind of showing up on these more almost tropical like beaches, kind of defying what we know about an Arctic seal. One of my favorite examples are the gray wolves, and a lot of us have probably heard stories about gray wolves in the Yellowstone. But it turns out through their recovery that they're excellent marine predators. It turns out they're really good swimmers, and they can hunt in the rocky intertidal and get all sorts of invertebrates. Mountain lions are not limited to mountains. Here's a picture of one in a grassland and they can be very effective predators in grasslands. People are finding orangutans don't necessarily need a forest. In fact, they can use some deforested areas quite well. Here's a jackal on a beach. And it turns out jackals are good at catching like small sharks that occur in the shallows. And then you have on the bottom right river otters. And river otters got a bad name because when we're describing river otters, they had already been hunted to, almost extinction. And so they were just kind of known for using rivers. But it turns out in the recovery, we're seeing them almost behave like sea otters. So the term river otter is probably needs to be updated a little bit. And so this is kind of challenging paradigms on what we know about top predators. But what's also challenging some paradigms about what we know about restoration is that top predators or the control of herbivores, it can be really, really important for successful restoration of vegetated ecosystems. And so we just published a paper a couple months back in the journal Science, and it was on the cover. Using a global meta-analysis, we looked at just about every vegetated ecosystem you can imagine that had experimental data. And so this is one of the plots from that paper. And what it just is showing is the effects of different treatments when you are planting plants in the ground. So you have herbivore exclusion on the top, predator reintroduction is the second one, um, facilitation inclusion, which just means planting other plants that might benefit those plants, and then competitive removal, which just means removing plants, maybe like invasives or something, and planting the natives that you want. And what we found was that overwhelmingly that including predators had the biggest positive effect because they're doing the natural kind of removal of herbivores, which are really important for plant restoration, right? Because when you're planting or when you're expecting new plants to form, they're going to be young juveniles that are going to be really fresh and lovely to taste for an herbivore. And so a lot of these, principles have come back to understanding, a lot about these predators, and the sea otters have been one of these kind of model predators for understanding not only the recovery of animals, but the recovery of ecosystems and food webs. Going to take a little water time out here. Okay. So we're going to go back to the sea otter. Sea otter hunt, and we're just going to think about California for now. The sea otter by the end of the 19th century in California was thought to be extinct. And that ended up being not correct, thankfully. There was a population that was rediscovered off the coast of Big Sur around the early 1900s. And then that story eventually made its way to Life magazine in 1938. And Life magazine says the extinct sea otter swims back to life. And if any of you all been to Big Sur, it's a hard place. Even for us humans, it's a hard place to get to. In fact, it's hard to get there right now. I don't think you could drive through there right now. And it's hard to get a boat there. And so because of that, the reason we probably found them off the coast was Big Sur is because humans can't get there to hunt them. So they're kind of hanging out there. And that it was a population of about 50 animals that has been expanding both north and south along the California coastline since. So by the time they were rediscovered, our kind of perception of a sea otter, especially here in California, was, oh, it's just a kelp forest animal, right? We only see them in kelp forest. It must be a kelp forest animal. And so if you can pretend like these two circles are what our perception, the human perception of the niche of the sea otter really was. And so in the 20th centuries, mid 20th century, it was really small. It was just like, oh, they're just kelp forest animals. When historically, the Native Americans, they really knew because they had management plans for this, that their historic range they could use all these different habitats. So now and we're kind of learning from them in their state of recovery as they're kind of moving into these new systems. So here's kind of our present view, right? Now that we know that they can use seagrass beds and we've seen them use salt marshes, that's great, right? And so now they're kind of expanding and they're expanding their true, what we call their true niche breadth. And we're finding that they have effects on seagrass recovery. Um, and I'm not going to go too far into this, but we're starting to see this up, throughout their range up in Alaska, in British Columbia, that these sea otters are really kind of promoting the health of seagrasses, much like we see with the kelp. So what was really fascinating when we were studying the seagrasses and kind of, taking our boat out of the water and like near the marshes and stuff, we started seeing the sea otters using salt marshes. And I'm just going to show you a video. I'm going to talk over the video, but what you're about to see is a sea otter in a tidal creek foraging on marsh crabs. Or you could call them shore crabs. They're much smaller than those rock crabs that they were eating in the seagrass. So here's the video. This was shot with a GoPro. This is Pickleweed Marsh. There's the sea otter right there. It's chowing down on some of these crabs. It's doing what we call periscoping, where it probably saw the GoPro even though there was no humans out there. And then it's diving back down to the fringe of the marsh to go grab some more of those crabs. In the background, you can see we have, and this is very common for doing predator studies, is that we have these exclusion cages right at the edge of the marsh where the sea otters can't access that area. And so what is we kind of found in the first paper we wrote about came out in Ecology in 2017. It was just documenting this, like, hey, everybody, nobody's seen this before. The sea otters are using salt marshes and then they're hauling out on them and then they're feeding in them and we don't know what's going on. And so we wrote a paper about how cool it was just to see this. But a couple of things really started kind of popping in my head, at least. And much like the seagrass beds, the salt marshes here in Elkhorn Slough, also throughout the state of California, are in serious trouble. In Elkhorn Slough in particular, the marshes are eroding away. There's several factors for that, including sea level rise. Those algal mats that I was talking to you about, they can smother the salt marsh. And then the modification of the hydrology in the system has increased the tidal forcing. And then you add on these crabs that we found that the sea otters really, really like to eat. And these crabs in particular, they're much smaller, right? They're about this size or so, maybe about that size, shore crabs. But when left unchecked by predators, what they'll do is they'll burrow into the marshes and onto the bank or into the banks of the marsh. And they'll kind of destabilize it because they create too many burrows and too many tunnels. And then what we found is that they also eat the roots that are also stabilizing that salt marsh. So we did about a 10-year study that just wrapped up a couple weeks ago. And it's cool. I'm going to show you the results. This is kind of one of the first presentations I've given where these results have been coming out. So what we found, we did a lot of different things similar to what we did in the seagrass. We did experiments in the field. We did a 3-year predator exclusion experiment. We did some experiments with feeding of marsh or feeding of the crabs on the marsh in the lab. And then we had all these great time series, and then we coupled it with all these different observations in these various tidal creeks. Here you're looking at a before after. So we knew basically when the sea otters started recolonizing the marsh, and we were able to look at things like the number of sea otters in the marshes, the number of crabs they consumed, and then the bank erosion. And you can see on the right here, this is just an illustration of how it works. So the sea otter, and it's pretty simple, right? The food web's very simple. It's really just this one predator, this one species of crab, and this one salt marsh plant, which is pickleweed. So it's a very simplistic food web that we rediscovered. And in it, the sea otters eat the crab, And without the crabs eating the marsh, it essentially protects those marshes and slows down erosion. As you can see in these graphs here, the sea otters went up on the top graph. You have post otter expansion. They were obviously consuming a lot more crabs. And what's also unique about this study is we had 35,000 foraging observations of sea otters in the system, which is very unprecedented for any sort of animal or predator. And then what we saw was that erosion was cut down significantly. It didn't stop it completely, but it slowed it down. Um, and so this paper was just published 2 weeks ago in Nature, and we were on the cover and all that. So that was great. So we're finding all sorts of things about the sea otter now. And this is just a little preliminary stuff. We're also finding that since they have such a big appetite on crabs, turns out they really like to eat these invasive European green crabs, which are now everywhere, almost everywhere in northern and central California, all the way up to now Alaska. And what we're finding is, and we haven't published this study yet, so it's kind of like, well, maybe they can, maybe they can't, but let's just say they really like to eat these things. And I was, when kind of my first observation of this occurred when we were doing these salt marsh studies. And so you find these green crabs hanging around in the kind of the deeper water below the salt marsh. But we were able to observe, a single sea otter rip through about 30 of these green crabs in about a half hour one day. And that was the first kind of big observation. It was like, whoa, that's a lot of green crab to be removing. And so it just kind of lends to a lot of interesting questions, especially given that we humans we're pretty bad at eradicating European green crab. And that's been published recently, unfortunately. In Bolinas Lagoon, there's been some big efforts to remove green crab, and it's a hard thing to do. So maybe a predator could do it. So when you put all this together, we have kind of rediscovered, it's a novel, but it's a rediscovered food web, meaning that it was probably known through, the Native Americans that this existed. So we're just rediscovering it now. That's a good pause break for water. All right. So, what can we've looked at what can a sea otter do for estuaries? We're also looking at we have looked at what can sea estuaries do for the sea otter. And when we think about where the sea otter lives now that we know that they can use these estuaries and they can use all these various habitats and that they can use the outer coast and kelp forest, what does it mean to have these variety of habitats to potentially use? And what is happening in certain parts of the sea otter range, the populations are actually doing quite poorly in terms of expansion and recovery. And I'm actually going to point you to the lower graph first. That's because that's California. So in the blue, that blue line, you can see that's the whole population of sea otters in the state of California, or sorry, that's Central California. So basically Monterey. And you can see it's flat lines. It also includes down to Santa Barbara too, kind of San Luis Obispo counties and Santa Barbara County. So it's essentially the entire population in California. Um, uh, anyways, the population is flatlined, and that's been a big concern because it's listed under the Endangered Species Act. So we want those populations to go up so the animal can recover. And what other researchers have found, my colleagues have found, is that on either range, on either side of their northern and southern range, near San Francisco and near Santa Barbara, there are these white shark populations that are, for whatever reason, keen on killing sea otters. And we know it because they end up biting these sea otters and then realize that they don't like that food and they spit it out, and then it ends up killing the sea otter, and they wash up on the shore with the obvious great white shark bite. So what we're seeing is that while that population of Central California and the outer coast is flatlining, the elkhorn slough population just keeps going up and up and up, which indicates that this might be a refugia for predators. Um, a similar thing's happening in Alaska and the Aleutian Islands, where killer whales or orcas are making a huge comeback, and they've kind of gone through a lot of the bigger marine mammals like the fur seals, and now are kind of left with sea otters to munch on, and they have driven their populations down to really low numbers. Um, Except for this one population that occurs in this estuary called Clam Lagoon, which has one of the biggest seagrass meadows on the entire planet. And it turns out that that Clam Lagoon might be serving as a refuge for killer whale predation because they can't killer whales aren't going to go into this little shallow lagoon, and great white sharks aren't going into Elkhorn Slough. So it might be just a good refugia for predators. I already talked about this kind of, you know, San Francisco Bay. There used to be a ton of sea otters in there. There's a fantastic book that was written in 1937 by a woman named Adele Ogden called The Sea Otter Trade. It's just loaded with information. I recommend reading it if you're interested in this. But we know sea otters once occurred in high numbers in San Francisco Bay. Now, um, we know also that there's been significant changes to San Francisco Bay since the time when they were hunting sea otters, right? You know, there's been a lot of changes. Um, and so we're kind of interested, especially as we think about sea otter expansion, like where will they go? You know, if we're to expand sea otters or sea otters are to expand naturally, where are they going to go? And the first stop really is San Francisco Bay. And so, but again, it has changed quite significantly. And so what we've been trying to do is trying to figure out, well, how many sea otters could San Francisco today support? And so taking all this information that we know about sea otters and that we know about sea otters now in estuaries and these various habitats, we can create models and predictions about how many sea otters the San Francisco Bay can support currently. And so what you see here is a map. You know, there's a bunch of blue here, which is just basically subtidal water, mixed in with a bunch of different habitats that include salt marshes, seagrass beds, and I think that's it for the vegetation. So the green is basically salt marshes and seagrass beds. Um, and so we can create, you know, based on this, we know how the sea otters interact with all these various ecosystems and how those ecosystems influence their population growth rate. And then we can stick it into a model. This is the model right here. And in this model, we predict that the upper threshold of sea otters in San Francisco Bay could reach 10,000. But on, you know, the best prediction that we have, and the most conservative, is that it would probably be a little bit more than 5,000, or between 5,000 and 6,000 sea otters could be supported by San Francisco Bay. And that's has a lot of assumptions with it. That assumes, like, you know, you're putting 20 animals in to begin with, and that you know, that it's going to take about 30 or 50 years for it to reach that number. How am I doing on time?
You're looking pretty good.
Okay, great. I am getting towards the end. I just want to make sure. So here, this is kind of what the model looks like when it's mapped out. A lot of the kind of the red just indicates really like where the sea otters would probably thrive the most. And these are primarily seagrass beds. We know that seagrass beds are kind of prime habitat compared to salt marshes. But you can see the bathtub ring, which is essentially the salt marshes around San Francisco Bay. Now that's great and all, and that assumes that there's no risk. So we've also mapped out the risks to sea otters. And this came from a paper from Jane Rudebush from San Francisco State, and us and some other colleagues. And it was just basically mapping the risks. And and that included like contaminants and diseases and shipping traffic and moorings and all sorts of things. And you can see that, you know, there's a big bright red kind of line, which is just the main shipping channel, which probably poses the greatest risk to sea otters in San Francisco Bay. It's probably not so much the contaminants because they live in Elkhorn Slough, and Elkhorn Slough is one of the most contaminated estuaries on the planet. And so, Elkhorn Slough does not have the motorized boat traffic like San Francisco Bay does. It has kayaks, which are way different than a motorized boat. And I pointed out Point Mulati because I gave a talk recently to the Point Mulati group. So, yeah, so yay, go Point Mulati. Okay, so now we're thinking about sea otters, and we being the kind of general community, which includes the scientists, the fishermen who are very concerned, the ecosystem managers, all the way up to the politicians are now thinking about sea otter recovery, and what they could possibly do, and what are the kind of the planned effects going to be. And so we're not only thinking about San Francisco Bay, right? We're thinking about Point Reyes. We're thinking about Tomales Bay. We're thinking about a lot of things that are going also on in Northern California, which I'm going to talk about next. In fact, I'm going to skip this slide and just go into the next part. So now everything's kind of coming full circle back to the kelp forest. Um, and some of you might know, or you might not know, there's been kind of a catastrophe that has occurred in Northern California, including Sonoma County, especially Sonoma County, where the kelp forest has basically disappeared. Um, and the reason for this is a couple different reasons, but a big one is that the kelp forests have basically been mowed down by sea urchins, and and it's due to a historic loss of the sea otters. So the sea otters were once here and all throughout Northern California. They were hunted to extinction in Northern California. And so we've been left without a predator for over 100 years or so, 150 years. But we recently, because of a disease outbreak of sea stars, the sea star wasting disease, we've lost all those predatory sea stars. And so essentially there are no urchin predators. And so the kelp forest has been totally deforested. And that's what you see in these pictures. These are before and afters here. This is I think at Fort Ross, right here in A, and now no kelp currently. And then this is kind of what it looks like underwater when you're going through this kind of urchin transition to what we call an urchin barren, where the kelp's all gone and everything that's left is an urchin barren. And so now, we're thinking like, well, what are the potential role of a sea otter, right? Now, the recovery of the sea otter might not only be good for these estuaries, right, but it could play a critical role, potentially for the restoration of kelp forest in California. So what we've kind of been left with, and now we're stepping out of the estuary completely, and this is you're kind of following my career because we're still working in the estuaries, but now we're working the kelp forest too, and we're trying to restore these kelp forests without having the predator around. And so what we're doing, is we're relying on humans to be the act like the sea otters essentially, and we send down commercial urchin divers. So we partner with commercial urchin divers who are kind of struggling right now, and so we're using their expertise, and we send them out to areas where we think would be good for restoration. And what they do is they go typically on hookah or sometimes on scuba, but they use sometimes surface supplied air. So basically a hose that goes to the surface providing oxygen. And they're down there hours every day just picking urchins. There's a couple different ways to remove urchins. One is through smashing, which has some ethical issues, like literally taking a hammer and just going doink, 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 like a whack-a-mole. Um, but that has ethical concerns. So what ends up happening is that the commercial urchin divers will harvest these things and then essentially sell them to people who will either use them as compost or try to beef up those urchins, because all those urchins are basically starving to death. So to beef them up and sell them on some market where you could some uni market. What we're doing is we're working with those divers, and people like the Nature Conservancy and the Greater Farallones National Marine Sanctuary. And we're culturing kelp in the lab and then planting it out in the field and coupling that with these urchin divers and their removals. And we're finding that we're getting kind of a lot of success. And that's what I'm ending with is that, yeah, there are no sea otters. Sea otters would be great to have, but right now we're kind of using humans and they're acting like the top predator in the absence of these predators. And we're using that same strategy where it's like, hey, we want the predator around controlling the herbivores, but we also want to plant things. And planting kelp is turns out to be a huge, huge challenge. So what we first do is we have like a little kelp farm now at Bodega Marine Lab in Bodega Bay. And so we grow kelp under these grow lights, right? So right now you're looking down on this right-hand image. It's like you're looking down a PVC pipe and that wrapped around that PVC pipe is twine. And we seed that twine with little baby or with little kelp spores. And then what you're seeing is are these little kind of tiny blades popping out. Those are little baby kelps about 5 millimeters. When they get about that size, maybe a little bit bigger, then we in these areas where the urchins have been removed, we spool out that twine onto rope. And and you might be like wondering, like, oh, what? This sounds crazy, or how did you figure that? We're literally kelp forest restoration is so brand new that we're literally figuring this out on the fly. And so, because kelp forest declines haven't been a thing, and like marshes and seagrasses, like, we know marshes have been collapsing for decades, and same with seagrasses. Kelp, this is just a recent thing that's occurred in the last decade. So we're all scrambling and we've had no success until this last summer, where we combined removing the urchins, so us acting as predators, and then planting, we started getting success. And for the first time in Northern California, we've been able to successfully grow kelp out in the field in areas where it's been lost. And I'm just going to wrap up with a couple of videos to show you that because it's really exciting. So this is us in May 2023. This is at Albion Cove, Albion River Cove, which is actually up in Mendocino County. But a lot of our work is spread throughout Sonoma, Marin, and Mendocino counties. Um, what's amazing about the bull kelp, and this is the kelp we're talking about, the species, it grows about a foot a day. And so that was May, and growing on our twine was put out with the little baby kelps. And here's just a few months later, August 2023. And it'll give you kind of a good understanding of how much that kelp has grown. And so bull kelp, yeah, it grows about a foot a day, and its whole goal is to kind of reach the surface, right, and maximize as much light as possible. And then eventually it puts on all this reproductive structures. But you can see it's hanging on to our lines. These are our lines that we put down at the bottom. And so it's grown from those little tiny microscopic kelp into these big kelp. And you can see what's really cool about it is that it's creating this fish habitat. You see some rockfish hanging and some surf perch, black surf perch hanging around there, and that's exactly what we want to see. And miraculously, it survived at least the first wave of big storms in atmospheric rivers that we had. So this is December of 2023. This is our blood kelp, and I'll turn off the volume. But now we have the bull kelp that's growing all the way to the surface and it's putting out these very long blades. Those blades right there are about 10 feet long. And so it's so cool. It's like one of the proudest moments of my life to get, a little tiny little baby thing. And for the first time, be able to actually restore this stuff where we've been really struggling over the last 3 or 4 years, just trying to figure out how do you get this to grow in a crazy environment such as Northern California outer coast. And it's all due to really the students and the collaborators that we've had in the lab. And so I'm just going to finish with that. I got a shout out to, to do these types of studies where you're looking at food webs and multiple trophic levels and and erosion, like geological processes and plants and scuba diving and all that stuff. It requires a huge team. And so I'm just, I can't thank everybody enough. Here's a kind of a collage of some people, important people who've been along this journey over the last 10 or so years. So I want to thank them. Here's some more people to thank. This is a photo of me in my current lab. I believe that was out at Timber Cove, which is Mendocino County. Just about to go do a dive. And then all these various funders, lots of different funders funding this stuff. So thank you to all of them. And yeah, if you're ever in my public service announcement to end this, if you're ever in the town of Moss Landing, and you see a sea otter crossing the road, just you slow down for the sea otter.